welcome all of you to this special briefing on accountability in Syria, achieving transitional justice in post-conflict society. Essentially, it's a combination of a briefing and a book review in a way, and I'll explain that in a minute after just making few introductory remarks. As most of you know, for the past 9 years, as the conflict in Syria continued to intensify, various parties in the region and actually throughout the international community have advocated persistently for the need to hold the Syrian government and other combatants or fighting parties in the conflict, to hold them accountable for many crimes against humanity that have been committed, going back to the beginning of the conflict. The demand for accountability increased whenever the fighting kind of tapered down, and conversely, the effort tended to peter out or even fizzle as the bloodletting resumed in this fitful and violent conflict, somehow assuming that all the attention and all the energies are going into the fighting rather than into ending the conflict and having to deal with the transitional justice stage. So although there was no shortage of probably well-meaning and not so well-meaning political energies spent in this regard, it's disappointing that very little progress has been made over these long years in holding any of the parties, frankly, responsible or accountable for their atrocities, be they individuals, groups, or state institutions for that matter. Countless investigations have been conducted throughout this period. I'm sure most of you are aware of those. Charges have been filed, warrants have been issued, even some arrests have been made, including some rumored arrest as we speak today in Europe. Yet, atrocities never ceased to allow for a serious, determined, rational, and sustained process of accountability thus far. So as we speak today and as we meet to discuss this important issue, we know the situation in Syria is not doing very well. Turkey and Syria are engaged directly and indirectly in significant ground and air military confrontations, particularly in the crowded northwestern corner of the country, with the real potential actually of drawing others to the fighting, including Russian forces, possibly Iranians, possibly even US troops that are also stationed in the area. There is fear here in Washington that they might be targeted or indirectly kind of dragged into the shooting. So it could lead to a much bigger fight than what we have been witnessing the past few days. The escalation, of course, as we all know, has led to dozens of casualties over the past few days. But more worrisome has been the human toll, which is, of course, familiar to most of us since the beginning of this conflict. The threat to send another large number, maybe hundreds of thousands of additional civilian refugees seeking relative safety. I mean, the numbers over the past few days have ranged between 300 and 500, even more, 1,000 people seeking safety along the Turkish border, away from this rather crowded, small field of military operations. At the UN yesterday, the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, called for cessation of hostilities to keep the situation from getting out of control. But as expected, he didn't fail to disappoint us. No mention was made of the need to kind of hold the fighting long enough to be able to hold the parties accountable for their crimes and for their actions. So the focus of our discussion today is really on this valiant effort that I refer to during this period to try to keep attention worldwide focused on the issue of accountability and not to be bogged down or totally inundated with the detail of the numbers and the casualties and the ugliness of the savagery even of this conflict over the past 9 years. So the essential kind of centerpiece of our conversation today is the book that these three special guests have participated in. It was edited by my colleague, Radwan Ziadi, who's a senior fellow here at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., where he deals chiefly with the issues pertaining to the Syrian crisis. Radwan has spoken on behalf of the people in Syria since the beginning of this conflict, before many, many audiences in this country and internationally. He has testified before the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. He has testified before different committees in Congress and spoken to many members of Congress individually. In addition, he decided that we should also involve two of his colleagues in writing this book, two who are familiar with you, who have been involved in Syrian issues over the past few years and in Arab issues and human rights, particularly here in Washington. Medea Zabadani has been our guest before. We're delighted to have her. She's the legal and judicial director at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, where she focuses on building a program that aims to contribute to a stronger legal culture in and about the Middle East. In addition to Medea, Muhammad Ala Ghanem is also here, and he's a Syrian pro-democracy campaigner, academic, writer, political activist, has covered it all. And he has been at it from the very beginning of the conflict. And I remember from 2011, he's been involved in the Syrian pro-democracy struggle, particularly the difficult task of trying to get attention here in Washington for the cause of Syria. So what we're going to do is give our three briefers or speakers 10, 12 minutes each or so, and beginning with Radwan, who has a short presentation. So I'm going to ask you to be a little cooperative with the logistics. Just turn around a little bit and watch the screen there, because he has a short video and presentation, but then he will resume with the discussion, and then he will be followed by Medea and by Muhammad. There are cards in front of you at the table and maybe behind you on the windowsill. If you do not have one accessible, just raise your hand. Q&As will be done basically after they're finished. The speakers are finished, and it will be in writing addressed to specific member of the panel. And when you're ready, just raise your card and staff will pick him up and bring him up here for me to read. Radwan, the microphone is yours.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, Khalil. Thank you for the Arab Center for supporting the book and hosting this event. It's difficult when speak on Syria these days, because it's still there are too many issues within one country. You have the issue of humanitarian crisis, and then of course the issue of armed conflict, and then the issue of rising of terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And this is why the international community decided actually everyone take one piece and deal with it, because too much complicated to deal with it. And this is why we thought the issue of justice and accountability left out of, there is no much talk about it in the political discourse, neither in Geneva nor in Astana, or even in the key capitals like Washington, D.C. The book tried actually to raise the issue, the importance of the issue, accountability and justice, not only for the Syrians and for the region, but also on the international stage. When small countries like Syria like massive human rights violations and gross atrocities in that level, very difficult for such country to deal with it during the conflict or even after. and it's need an attention for the international community. What I'm trying to do actually to go through into the patterns of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Syria in the last 8 years, and how each one of these, it's required, it's a lot of investigations, and it's need, of course, the importance of attention. And then May will speak on the efforts of accountability and transitional justice, which has been ongoing from the civil society and from the UN and from different international initiatives. And Muhammad also will touch the issue of enforced displacement, which being the main focus of the book. We started actually talking a book in 2015, where Aleppo was the center of attention of evacuation. But when we see actually, this video is taken last week in Ma'arat al-Nu'man. Ma'arat al-Nu'man, it's the main city between Aleppo and Damascus. 400,000 inhabitants in the city, and see actually the evacuation of 400,000 of people there into the Syrian-Turkish border, of fear of prosecution and killing by the Assad government and the Russian Air Force. It does give us one sense that what we started as the evacuation in Aleppo, it's continued in the last 2 and 3 years, and still, while we are sitting there, it's ongoing. Not the international community failed to address the issue, and it's make it more difficult because the last humanitarian situation in northern, I'm reading here from the UN figures. We have 11 million IDP in need of humanitarian assistance, 6 million IDP displaced, and the UN estimated more than 500,000 displaced from Saraqib, Ariha, and Ma'arat al-Nu'man into the border between Turkey and Syria. And since Turkey already have 3.5 million and 4 million refugees, it will not open the door for any more Syrian refugees. And this is why we estimating more than 4 million stuck at the border between Syria and Turkey. What I'm trying to focus here on the patterns of crimes committed in the last 8 years. I categorize as 5 main war crimes and crimes against humanity. The use of the Air Force, the use of prohibited weapons, and the siege on the opposition areas and populated areas, and then torture and sectarian crimes, and finally the forced displacement. Why I put a genocide there? Of course, still it's debatable among the legal scholars, because it's a genocide against the Yazidis in Iraq, ISIS ethnic groups. But we personally believe what's happened in the use of the chemical weapons in 2013, for the government, it has the intent of genocide. And we can go more into details later on. Of course, the use of the Air Force and the Syrian government, the Syrian opposition called for the no-fly zone in November 2011. The Syrian government started the use of the Air Force in July 2012. It's considered now it's the main the main force has been used in any other civil wars in history. No other governments or any other military institutions used in that level the Air Force against the populated areas. And in the book, actually, we make some historical comparisons when they used actually the Air Force in Chechnya before, And then also the Soviet Union used the Air Force in Afghanistan in 1982, but not that level and not continuous, which led to systematic, widespread, and indiscriminate use of the Syrian. The signature of the Syrian Air Force, it's the barrel bombs. And then of course, it's an amazing study done by Harvard in 2012 when they collected the data from all the human rights organizations, and they found it at only 1% of the people who've been killed by the barrel bombs were rebels or combatants. 99% of the victims are civilians. Among them, 25 are children. And then, of course, the signature, as I said, the barrel bombs. And this video, 30 seconds, shows what the barrel bombs is. This is my hometown, Daria. It's cheap. It costs less than $10. And it just been pushed by helicopter or any air jets. Indiscriminate ways, never recognized. See how they push it? It creates, of course, devastating effects on the civilians. This is some pictures in Douma, 2013, 14, and this is some of the pictures in Aleppo. And of course, that's led to the evacuation of most of the people. As we see now in Ma'arat al-Nu'man, 400,000 left the city. That's what happened in Daraya, in other areas who's been targeted by the barrel bombs. Unfortunately, until today, the international community failed actually to prevent the Syrian government from using such kind of weapons. There was an important try by former Secretary of State John Kerry in 2016 by the Russians, where they put the responsibility on Russia if the Syrian government used the barrel bombs. The agreement actually lived only by 1 week. And later on, the Syrian government continued to start using the barrel bombs. This is some of satellite images of the city of Aleppo. City of Aleppo before 2011, it was 5 million. It's the second largest city in Syria. Now see, actually, it's all gray areas who are affected by the barrel bombs. The second pattern of crimes in the Syrian war was the use of the prohibited weapons, especially as we know in the Hague agreements, the use of the chemical weapons is prohibited, no matter the target. If the target, military target or the civilian target, it's prohibited because it's designed to cause the injury and uneasy suffering. But the Syrian government used the prohibited weapons 37 times. And if we look into the reports of the OPCW, it's confirmed the use of the chemical weapons 37 times in different areas in Syria. And until today, neither the UN or the OPCW be able to state clearly in their statement about the responsibility. It's been 3 tries to investigate the use of the chemical weapons, and they confirmed the use of the chemical weapons. But according to the rules and the veto on Russians, that's prevent from mentioning the responsibility of the Syrian government or the Assad government of the use of the chemical weapons. And then, of course, we all see these photos in Eastern Ghouta in 2013. Then later on, the third pattern of crimes, which has much more focus in the first chapter in the book, of course, the siege. because the siege is not being used anymore by the Syrian government, and with the international community has short memory, forget the horror happens for 1.5 million Syrians who's been under siege since 2012, started on November 2012 until 2017. This is the picture of Ahmed, who's actually the first one in Medea who's been died because lack of food of the siege. In the book, it details the third, and Jeanine also wrote an interesting book. It's a comparison between the Bosnia and Herzegovina, and she was in Sarajevo. It's considered as the longest siege in history, comparing to the siege in Aleppo, which actually, and later on in Eastern Ghouta. The siege, it's important because it's a scandal not only to the international community, to the UN itself. The UN itself, the first report OCHA issued, it says actually the situation in Medea as example, and they have access to food and water on, and later on, 3 weeks later, a breakdown of one of the cases of Ahmed. That's the situation, and that's of course create criticism within the UN mechanism, within the UN debate. That's the reporting on Syria within the UN. It wasn't accurate enough and rely more and more on resources from the Syrian government rather than actually do an independent research or reach out to the areas. Because since the first siege started in Syria in 2012 until 2017, at least 13 Security Council resolution issued regarding the siege area. And each Security Council resolution refer into more areas. The first one, 1680, refer into 35 areas under siege. Later on, it became 54 areas, where at that time the UN trying to mediate in Geneva and in Astana, but actually the siege been intensified by the government, and it became strategy by itself by the Syrian government to impose to impose a surrender for all these areas, and as a total punishment to the civilians who decided to stay there or to live there. And of course, the results of those all 54 areas who under siege was the evacuation, which Muhammad can talk more about it. And all, of course, in what we call it, this is not green buses. The green buses became a norm to put more the population and send them into northern part of Syria. The fourth elements of the pattern of war crimes and crimes against humanity, of course, the crimes of torture. Nobody knows or have an estimate number of the political prisoners in Syria, but mostly from 80 to 125,000. And this is actually pictures smuggled by Caesar, who's now passed into law, Caesar law. 55 photos shows the systematic torture inside the Syrian secret prisons. And of course, that's led to the what's now Caesar bill. The fifth element and the final one, the forced displacement. What I found the book actually that most of the displacement, the forced displacement, not based on the sectarian divide rather than the political divide. That doesn't make it in much. I mean, the target, the political target of the Syrian government, not for the groups, they are actually Sunni or it's as non-loyal to the Syrian government. And this is why is not make it much easier to be non-sectarian target rather than a political target. Of course, displacement, which led to the more than 7 million refugees Syrian abroad. And then, of course, after all of these policies and targets, the Syrian government issued dozens of laws to prevent displaced people or the refugees from returning back. The Decree 66, Decree 12, 2006, and then, of course, the final one, the Law 10, 2018, which mean all of them have been applied today. And of course, that's led to the flee of the Syrian refugees. The peak of the crisis was 2014, 2015. And now, if the campaign in Idlib intensify and continue, we'll expect actually even another peak of the Syrian refugees, especially those who are in the border between Syria and Turkey. And it's still, Za'atari is one of the second largest refugee camps in the world, and continue, unfortunately, to stay like that. Thank you very much.
Mike?
Sure. Thank you, Khalil and Radwan, for having me, and Radwan for inviting me to contribute to the book. I think Radwan's presentation really drives home why it's so difficult to talk about accountability in Syria. How do you even begin? The extent of war crimes and crimes against humanity that have taken place, the fact that there are an immense amount of perpetrators involved, the fact that these crimes continue even now with impunity, including the forced displacement of the people of Idlib, which is happening as we speak. It's overwhelming, to say the least. But at the same time, it drives home, I think, two lessons around accountability. The first is that the time for justice is now, and that justice is not a marginal conversation. So since the very beginning, you heard Radwan talk about justice being a sideline conversation. But in actuality, when Syrians peacefully took to the streets in 2011 to demand freedom and justice, part of the reason they took to the streets was because they wanted to hold their governments accountable for crimes. So honoring the Syrian people and the 500,000 plus who have been killed and the millions displaced and the millions made refugees really starts and ends with the question of accountability. And it's something that should be an ongoing conversation. It's not something we can afford to wait until violence comes to an end, because there are many tools of accountability that can and have been accessed by civil society. And I would say the second lesson is that Syria has taught us to be creative in the accountability space. A lot of the traditional legal mechanisms that had been in place in the wake of the Holocaust and otherwise have proven to be either politicized or difficult to access. Things like the International Criminal Court, things like the doctrine responsibility to protect. These are things that have been made almost useless, I hate to say, by the experiences that we've had in Syria. And so I'd like to spend the rest of my remarks laying out sort of three categories of accountability tools and mechanisms that are being engaged on. And I think that will hopefully add a little bit of hope to the conversation. It's very sobering to hear. The first set of tools are those of documentation. The idea of documentation in and of itself as a tool for accountability. Very early on in the Syrian war, Syrian civil society organizations, journalists, lawyers recognized that if they weren't documenting what was happening, who was doing it, and who was being affected, that no one else really would. This was because the space for journalism increasingly existed. It became difficult, if not impossible, for journalists to safely cover what was happening in Syria. It became very difficult for civil society organizations not to be targeted, for the leaders in civil society organizations not to be arrested. And so it became that much more important to document for two purposes, both for the sake of influencing and informing policy, but also for the long term. And that was to preserve the history and really to give credence to the lived realities that Syrians had undergone. particularly in the wake of these disinformation campaigns that we're seeing by Russia and otherwise. It's more important than ever for Syrians to have a place to have documented what happened to them, as opposed to being told by external actors what's happening. This documentation, of course, has helped contribute to a sense of truth and a sense of narrative. And I think it's extremely important that we pause and recognize that as a goal of accountability by itself. It's not enough, obviously, but it is an important tool of accountability. The same documentation has been used for a number of different tools. We've seen open source investigations by excellent organizations like Bellingcat, the work of New York Times journalists who have been able to actually look at what is being documented and say, these were the perpetrators, this is what happened. And of course, we've seen documentation for the sake of legal accountability and evidence collection as well. There are organizations around the US, around Europe, that are actively collecting evidence in the hopes that one day there will be a space to prosecute these crimes. I think documentation overall shows us that there are immediate things that we should and can be investing in, and that they serve different purposes, whether that is truth, legal prosecution, or otherwise. The second bucket of accountability tools that I want to delve into are the UN mechanisms. And I would be remiss if I didn't start this off by saying that the UN has let down the Syrian people. Not just the UN, I would say the international community as well. The tools at their disposal, whether it has been the International Criminal Court, the UN Security Council, issues like the politicization of aid, these are things that books can be written on and should be written on one day. It's not the focus of my talk today, but I did want to start recognizing that. At the same time, though, there are two tools that I'd like to point out when it comes to UN mechanisms that have served an important role in this space for accountability. The first has been the UN Commission of Inquiry on Syria, which was established in August 2011. That body is responsible for investigating human rights abuses, and it has issued a number of important reports that have given credence to the civil society documentation that has been done. It's been and that body has recognized perpetrators that have committed certain crimes. It has documented things in reports that I think will continue to be useful for a long time, whether it's things like sexual and gender-based violence, violations affecting children, the issue of the return of refugees, and this commission continues to do important work. And the second I want to focus on is really, it's called the International Independent Impartial Mechanism, what is known as the IIIM. This is a body that was created out of a recognition that Syrians likely weren't going to access the International Criminal Court. And it looked to be difficult, if not impossible, for there to be a space to prosecute crimes inside Syria, of course. And so this body was created thanks to the involvement of accountability actors all over the world to really say that we want to create an entity, the role of which will be to collect evidence, to put together case files that could then actually be sent to courts and jurisdictions around the world so that these cases can be prosecuted. This is a relatively new entity, but it's a very heartening, I think, example of what can be done when we think creatively about what works and what doesn't, and also think critically about how we can look long term. And the final bucket of accountability tools I'd like to talk a little bit about are really prosecutions outside of Syria. Like I said before, the International Criminal Court is difficult to access. It's not impossible, thanks to the excellent work of organizations like Guernica that are thinking of ways to access the court via refugees that are now in Jordan. There's a lot of interesting work being done in this space, but at the same time, it remains really unlikely. Syria is not a signatory to the Rome Statute, and the only other primary way that the case would make it to the UN Security Council is via the to the International Criminal Court is via a UN Security Council referral, and made impossible thanks to the vetoes of Russia and China, which have been consistent vetoes since the beginning of the war. That being said, the International Criminal Court is not the only entity. There has been a reinvigorated attention towards really being creative about how Syrians can access justice. And I would say this is being done through a concept broadly defined as extraterritorial jurisdiction. The idea that even if a crime was not committed in a particular country, that particular country should have an interest in prosecuting that crime, particularly crimes of a extensive, immense nature, like war crimes, genocide, torture. A specific subset of that jurisdiction is the idea of universal jurisdiction, which, irrespective of whether the perpetrator is from a particular country, irrespective of whether the victim is from a particular country, a country might have an interest to prosecuting these crimes because it wants to send a message that these are crimes that the international community has collectively stated cannot and will not stand. And we're seeing a lot of really good work being done in this space. I would say, I point your attention to a few. There's so many organizations, so I don't want to list all of the organizations involved in this space, but I would say there have been structural investigations that have been started in Germany, Sweden, and France that are looking into the Syrian war more broadly to identify potential cases that are being brought. There are specific cases that have already been brought and are in the investigation phase across Europe that, thanks to the excellent work of civil society organizations, Syrian and otherwise, and those cases are very promising. And in fact, there is the first ever torture case is set to actually be heard later this year in 2020, thanks to the effort and work of these civil society organizations and legal advocates. And there are arrest warrants, like Khalil mentioned, that have been issued in furtherance of particular cases. And while it can seem difficult or politicized to be able to implement these arrest warrants, the fact that they've been issued means that there is momentum and that it's sending a strong message, I would say, that these are crimes that cannot be allowed to stand. I don't want to go into too much detail because I can talk about accountability all day long, but I do want to end on a sort of what can we do about it note. I think there's a lot that can be done. There's no doubt that Syria has driven home the reality that a lot of the mechanisms that we have need to be amended, improved, strengthened. We need to think critically about what slogans like never again, if these are slogans or if they actually mean something to us as an international community. And we need to look really hard about what it means and why accountability is important and how it's so central to peace and justice, of course. I would say that as advocates, there are a few things that can be done. Advocates should be engaging with their governments to encourage their governments to set aside more funding for accountability efforts, whether that's civil society organizations or otherwise. Advocates should be engaging with their governments and lobbying those governments to improve their human rights laws. Here in the US, we have pretty weak universal jurisdiction laws, and while we have had a successful civil suit brought under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act on behalf of the family of Marie Colvin, we don't have the same strong criminal accountability laws that we see in other European countries. We can be advocating with the US government to really fill these loopholes and gaps. And there are initiatives by the ABA and otherwise to begin to think critically about filling these gaps. I would also say lobbying your governments and advocates should be engaging with governments to give more funding to entities like the IIIM. As we know, these entities are only as strong as the funding and political support that they receive. And finally, I would say, as those in the civil society and legal space have led this conversation, and I think continuing to think about ways to engage Syrian civil society, thinking as lawyers how we can translate materials into Arabic in order to reach and access Syrian victims and Syrian civil society organizations to make sure they're driving the conversation and they're a part of the conversation. Setting aside programming towards training and explainers and funding, explaining things like universal jurisdiction, like the ICC, like these entities that can often be technical and can seem out of hand. I think there's a lot that can be done, but I will say that I firmly believe, and I think we all believe, that accountability is an integral part of the conversation, and it's something that can't be sidelined or marginalized. And if any of the peace processes or constitutional processes or whatever they may be stand any chance, accountability really has to be at the center of that conversation.
Thank you.
Mohammed? Please.
First off, I'd like to thank the Arab Center Washington, D.C. I'd like to thank Khalil Radwan for giving me this opportunity to address you today and to also contribute to the book. Radwan asked me to take a deep dive into the phenomenon of forced displacement and demographic re-engineering in the country, population transfers. Which is what my chapter actually discusses. Now, as you know, as we gather here today, Sadly, hundreds of thousands of people in the province of Idlib are being subjected to a systematic forced displacement campaigns. Now, the thing about Idlib is that Idlib is technically the site of a so-called de-escalation zone. This de-escalation zone, which is pretty much a province-wide ceasefire. So this de-escalation zone was negotiated by Russia, Turkey, and Iran as part of the Astana process. So what we're witnessing today is the liquidation of the ceasefire, or the liquidation of this de-escalation zone. In 2018, in southern Syria, the province of Dar'a also saw a similar fate. There was also another de-escalation zone in Dar'a. This time it was negotiated between Russia and the United States, and the province also saw a similar fate. Hundreds of thousands, actually tens of thousands of people in Dar'a were forcibly displaced from their homes. Before that, Ghouta, eastern Ghouta, the suburbs of Damascus, northern countryside of Damascus, also was the site of a de-escalation zone. Also, as a result of that, people were forcibly displaced using the green buses that Dr. Radwan Ziadeh talked about. Before that, Homs. So my chapter looks at these patterns of forced displacement, and it makes a counterintuitive claim. The claim that the chapter makes is that these ceasefires, whether they're called local ceasefires, local truces, de-escalation zones, freeze zones as they were called by the United Nations, eventually always lead to forced displacement and population transfers. So what I did was I actually surveyed all of the examples of the communities in Syria that were forcibly displaced since 2012 through 2017, and sadly, there was always a ceasefire involved. So that was always the eventual outcome of a ceasefire. Now, those ceasefires, when they first came into vogue, especially here in Washington, D.C., in 2014, they were really misunderstood by analysts in D.C. Two former Obama administration officials, for example, in a paper they wrote, talked about those local ceasefires as an example of what they called the ink blot strategy. And basically said they can lead to win-win situations. You also had Carnegie, for example, another think tank, also published a paper, and they said those ceasefires could eventually empower communities, and they said such ceasefires could turn into more lasting agreements for local governors. They could embolden and empower civilian communities, making it harder for their leaders and commanders to order a return to armed conflict. United Nations, too, also embraced some of those ceasefire. One of the humanitarian leaders of the United Nations also said they could be, he was talking about the ceasefire in Homs that also eventually saw the forced displacement or evacuation of tens of thousands of people from Homs itself, and then eventually from War. Also, as he said, it's, quote, an example of what could be done. Now, this effusive praise that those, what I call them bogus peace deals, received, actually emboldened. I argue that they emboldened the Assad regime. Okay, so that's the first claim that I make. The second claim that I make is that by exhaustively looking at all of the case studies, one can't help but conclude that these ceasefires that always eventually led to forced displacements and population transfers were an integral part of Assad's military strategy. So how does a ceasefire eventually lead to demographic re-engineering? Again, it's a counterintuitive claim, but that's a claim I make, and I have provided a lot of examples. I looked at Homs looked at Aleppo, eastern Ghouta, Dar'a, the suburbs of Damascus, Babila, Qaboon, the hometown of Dr. Radwan Ziadeh, Daraya. And I argue that those ceasefires actually served two core purposes. First purpose was to help the Assad regime eventually conquer densely populated urban areas. So that was goal number one. The ceasefire, a ceasefire in a particular locale actually would actually take place after let's say a given town or village was besieged for, say, a year or two, or people within that locale would be reduced to eating grass, stray cats and dogs, like we saw in Mu'addamiyya, for example, until they eventually had to agree to very harsh terms. Things like those communities had to, for example, relinquish heavy weapons in case they had any heavy weapons. The fighters in those towns had to be evacuated to the province of Idlib. So basically, dispossessing those towns or robbing those towns of any defense mechanisms in case those or in a case of those ceasefires, or the terms of those ceasefires not being honored by the Assad regime, which is what happened. The chapter also discusses what I called the ratcheting effect. So initially, the regime would ask, for example, for the flag of the Assad regime to be flown in a particular town in return for some aid access. Eventually, that aid access would be curtailed or limited, and then the Assad regime would renege on the deal, and they would ask for more and more and more and more until the town, a particular town, would eventually be completely overrun. Of course, overrunning a town only happened after the town had been systematically weakened over an extended period of time. The second objective that I argue these ceasefires served was to relieve the chronic shortage of manpower that the Assad regime had to deal with. The Assad regime, as a minority regime in 2011, 2012, played a game of whack-a-mole in Syria. They had elite forces. They were unable to rely on their entire military, so they had elite forces, and they would focus their elite forces, such as the 4th Armored Mechanized Division, on a given, let's say, city or neighborhood like Baba Amr in Homs. They would decimate the opposition in that neighborhood, only for the opposition to emerge in a different neighborhood, say Wa'ar, or a completely different province. So they would have to be deployed elsewhere. And after you do that for a year or two, after they did that for a year or two, they were overstretched, stretched too thin, and they were fatigued. And that's why they needed support from Iran. That's why eventually they needed a full-scale military intervention by Russia. Now, how did those ceasefires help with the issue or the problem of shortage of manpower that the Assad regime had to struggle with or had to deal with? They froze certain fronts and freed up regimes' resources to focus on towns or places according to the regime's military plan or strategy were deemed as to have a higher priority. For example, a deal was struck with the town or the suburb of Mu'addamiyya in south of Damascus in 2013. Mu'addamiyya was a restive town. It was an opposition hub, and it also provided a launch pad for attacks against the capital, Damascus. So the Assad regime was interested in neutralizing that, but Assad had to deal with Mu'addamiyya and Ghouta and Daraya all at the same time. So what they did, it was neutralize through a so-called ceasefire the town of Mu'addamiyya, which allowed them to focus all of their energy on the town of Daraya. Eventually, the town of Daraya was emptied down to its last resident. They all had to evacuate, quote unquote, evacuate to Ghouta, to Idlib. And then the regime went back and focused their effort on Ma'addamiya and took over Ma'addamiya. We saw that in Medea and Zabadani. Dr. Radwan showed you one of the photos from Medea where that really gruesome siege took place. Medea and Zabadani, two towns right next to each other. The regime also did the same, focusing on one town, offering a ceasefire to the other town until both towns were overrun. And the same blueprint was used throughout the country, and that's how we ended up here today. Now, as May mentioned, the UN was culpable, and this is something my chapter looks into. And again, the chapter does not make vague, general, abstract claims. I provide specific examples. For example, the town of Medea, or the area of Medea and Zabadani. We found out after the fact that the UN operation in Damascus actually allowed the Assad regime to cook the books, quote unquote, or to manipulate the figures that were used in their reporting, and to downplay the significance or how the scale of the suffering in Medea using figures provided by the Assad regime, because, as you know, the UN can only work through states, and they needed the cooperation of the regime. So I guess that was a compromise that they decided they needed to make. Only after those gruesome images attracted global attention did we find out about that major ethical compromise that the UN in Syria made. There was another example. The former UN Special Envoy to Syria, Staffan de Mistura, announced an initiative for Aleppo called freeze zones. And the Assad regime accepted the freeze zones initiative because it dovetailed really nicely with the Assad regime's ceasefire military strategy, while cutting the last supply line to Aleppo. So the last supply line to Aleppo was cut, yet diplomatically, what you heard in the news was that we made a diplomatic breakthrough. So the third thing that these ceasefires did was provide an illusion of a political process. International actors had something to point to. So we have this, we have de-escalation zones, we have local truces, we have local ceasefires. We're actually doing something. De Mistura just was able to win this from this major concession from the Assad regime, where in fact that did sort of diplomacy. And I'm not suggesting here that de Mistura really wanted people in Aleppo to starve, but that's eventually how that strategy that embraced the Assad regime's local ceasefire strategy, that's how it translated into reality. As a result, millions of people, Idlib, the province of Idlib, was used as dumping ground until the most recent campaign in Idlib started. So now we have people in Idlib now are not just Idlib natives, they're from all over Syria. And they have pretty much run out of places to run to because the borders with Turkey are closed. Now, the other thing that I would like to point out is that while I do agree with Dr. Radwan Ziadeh about the political objective of conquering and the political objective of conquering communities that are not loyal or opposition communities, I think there's also a large and overwhelming body of evidence that points in the direction of sectarian cleansing, demographic engineering that is highly sectarian. For example, we saw what we call the deal of four towns. Medea, Zabadani, the two towns I've already mentioned, that were besieged and eventually accepted as so-called ceasefire. And then two towns in northern Syria that were besieged by rebel hardliners. The residents of Kafreya and Foa, mostly Shia, were transported to Medea and Zabadani, resettled in Medea and Zabadani, and the residents of Medea and Zabadani were were transferred to the north. We've seen also that in Damascus, for example, in Damascus proper, Iran purchased large tracts of land, and some areas were designated for quote-unquote redevelopment. I have a lot of friends who used to live in Medea Zabadani, heavily, densely populated area. We're talking tens of thousands of families, hundreds of thousands of people. They all had to evacuate. They all had to leave. They were given notices. They had to leave. The state provided them with like a year, 2 years rent of, in return for, or as a form of compensation for basically having to leave their homes. And of course, the so-called 2 years rent in today's Syria is not adequate, or wouldn't be sufficient to get you a place for, would be only sufficient to get you a place for a few months. So I have seen evidence of systematic sectarian cleansing, also facilitated through local ceasefires or de-escalation zones. Most recently, Dr. Radwan alluded to law number 10. So this is a law that the regime issued in 2018, and it basically designates some areas for quote-unquote redevelopment. Mostly, I've seen some reports coming out of Eastern Ghouta, for example, about how communities there had to initially had 30 days in order to prove that they owned property or losing those properties. Eventually, it was changed from 30 days to a year, but that's what I own 2 condominiums in Damascus, and I don't have access to them because to have access to them, I would need to prove that I own them, and I would need to do it in person. This is something I've personally researched, and doing that, it would be tantamount to suicide. I also can ask friends or extended family members to sell them on my behalf, pretty much for the same reason. So this is another legal tool that is being used to dispossess communities and to to entrench the realities created through those local ceasefires. Final thing I'd like to say is that we here in the United States, we thought, we looked into what to do to keep these new realities from being entrenched. One thing we did was share those conclusions with the House Foreign Affairs Committee as they were drafting the Caesar Civilian Protection Act that recently passed. And because of that, if you've had a chance to look at Caesar, Section 7413 specifically looks into this issue. It talks about strategy relating to areas of Syria in which civilians are subject to forced displacement. And it asks the administration, the Trump administration, calls on the Trump administration to provide strategy specifically to deter turning those new demographic changes into permanent realities. So this is something, it's a start, definitely not sufficient, but it's a start, and we're glad that this is now, it's the law of the land, and it's something that the administration has to implement. Hopefully I hope that they get the implementation right, but it's a step along the way. So again, to sum up, the strategy of ceasefires, regardless of what it was called, sometimes it was called local ceasefires, local truces, de-escalation zones, freeze zones, so forth, was used systematically by the Assad regime to facilitate forced displacement, population transfers, demographic re-engineering, and yes, sectarian cleansing. Those as peace deals or peace initiatives, they were initially embraced by some analysts here in Washington, D.C., definitely by the Obama administration in 2016. The Obama administration in 2016 were working on what they called violence reduction measures. by the United Nations, despite Syrians reaching out to all of the aforementioned individuals and entities and saying that those ceasefires are actually not real. You guys call them here ceasefires, we call them kneel or starve. Kneel or starve. You basically have to bow down to our terms, or you have to starve because of the sieges that we are going to be imposing on you for a long time until you capitulate. And any transitional justice process will have to, in the future, to reckon with these realities. Even if the fighting stopped in Syria tomorrow, even if Assad is killed or leaves power in Syria tomorrow, we have dozens of communities that remain deeply wounded, that don't have the same populations that they used to have just a couple of years ago. And this is something that any serious, credible, robust transitional justice process will have to look into. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. Just wanted to remind you again, for those who are interested in following up and getting a copy or taking a look at the book, we haven't been able to get copies to sell today. There's only one sample copy out there. But there are flyers that were given to you on your way in. They include a 30% coupon in the back for those who are interested. The book has been published by Lexington Books, and they are available both in hardback and in electronic ebook version for those who are interested. Anything else on the publication of the book? Is it going to be the same company marketing it in the States, or yeah, okay.
I have something about the publication itself. One thing you learn pretty quickly about the business of academic publishing is that by the time the final product is out, it really takes a long time for an academic, especially peer-reviewed academic book to be published. So some of the things that I personally have in the book may have been overtaken by events. Sadly, however, only in the sense that the trends I identified only gotten worse, not any better. But it's something I learned about academic publishing. It takes a really long time for the book to finally come out.
All right, thank you. The first question I have is addressed to May. It's from Roger Phillips, Legal Director, SJAC. Given the focus of the what you mentioned with regards to the universal jurisdiction prosecutors on extremist fighters, can we expect comprehensive justice from this mechanism? And how can average Syrians contribute to justice efforts given all the limitations that you have mentioned?
Sure. Thank you, Roger. So across Europe, I would say we're seeing the beginnings of investigations of cases looking into crimes committed by extremist fighters, by ISIS, by rebels in some cases, and increasingly, but very slowly, by members of the Assad regime. I think it's ironic because obviously the vast majority of war crimes have been committed by the Assad regime and its allies. That being said, I think there are some positive indicators, whether it's the issuing of these arrest warrants in the cases in Germany and France, particularly against Jamil Hassan and Ali Mamlouk, names who continue to exercise influence to various degrees in Syria. I think the beginnings of the torture trial that's expected to begin this year, that's a case involving, I think, Syrian regime affiliates that committed torture. That's a good start. It's not sufficient, and I think it's slow, and that's precisely why I think it's extremely important for us to be having interdisciplinary conversations with lawyers, civil society, victims, and policymakers to think about what limitations the legal scheme has. How can we strengthen laws for places to be more like Germany, where we're seeing a lot of positive movement? How can we strengthen laws across Europe? How can we strengthen laws across the US, across Canada, to begin to expand the tools? I think as we get farther and farther away, it remains more important than ever for these conversations to be had. And I think as we think critically, when we begin to bring different folks in the room together, we begin to see, oh, these are where the loopholes might be, or this is how we can strengthen things together. I think the work that SJAC has done is excellent in this space, particularly in translating and like putting together guides of understanding, first of all, universal jurisdiction and extraterritorial jurisdiction laws in countries, expanding those to the other countries. I think thinking even about setting up working groups for each of those countries to talk about implementation and access, to begin to liaise with victim communities that we're increasingly seeing in places like Europe and the US. Those are places to start. I think it will continue to be slow, but I'm seeing a lot of positive movement. And as we continue to advocate with our governments to even invest more resources into this space, particularly as violence wanes, if you will, there's money that exists and that should be going towards supporting these accountability efforts. And I think engaging policymakers towards that will help us see a little bit of movement. But again, I think prosecutions are not the end-all be-all, which we know as lawyers. There's a lot of different forms of accountability, and I think there's a premium put on prosecutions, but the reality is with a war as complex as Syria, there have been so many perpetrators and so many victims that it will be impossible, unfortunately, to hold all of them accountable. But in as much as we can support documentation, we can support the writing of history, we can support even victims to be heard. Maybe we should be thinking about other fora in which victims can be heard. I think then you open up the doors for justice a little bit. We got to start somewhere. But thank you to SJAC for leading us in that space.
All right, thank you. Contessa Bourbon, a journalist, asks, how are civil society and the international community, the EU, working to realize peace settlement in Syria? What are the challenges they face? This is addressed to all three of you. If you care to tackle this question.
I'm sorry.
The challenges being faced by civil society, the international community, particularly the EU, in trying to realize a peace settlement for Syria. What are their main challenges?
If I just actually, of course, each crisis has some mostly disadvantages and some advantages. One of the bright moments we had, the vibrant Syrian civil society we have, comparing to other countries who went through what Syria is going through right now, we don't see such a vibrant, active civil society. I just alluded to now two documentary movies nominated for the Oscar. One of them even they won the best documentary movie for Sama in UK, and most likely she will win the Oscar as the best documentary. Those two documentaries is one of the cases of documentation. For Sama, a movie, actually Waad al-Khatib decided to document her memoirs in Aleppo in the last 5 years. After this, 55,000 of images, and they made one of I mean, it's a torture movie. I watched the movie without a dry eye. It's for almost 2 hours. It's a very powerful movie. But that's tell you about the role of the civil society taking some small initiatives and making through. That's very important. And I think now the voice of justice and transitional justice in the Syrian crisis, it's unfortunately it's only became now the voice of the civil society, and those the people who are interested in justice and accountability. This is why there is too much initiatives in the last 8-9 years. But also we see the civil society is built on the issues, and that's make the Syrian case much more creative. There are some cases, of course, as Mai mentioned, on universal jurisdiction in Spain, in Sweden, and of course, most of the cases focuses on the small fish, and that does not build the case anyway. But it's of course it's a beginning to in the book, in my chapter, I argue for the need to have an hybrid court in Syria. We have 7 special tribunal since 1994. The first one, of course, of former Yugoslavia, and the last one now, the Special Chamber of Cambodia. Those 7 established by Security Council resolution, except one of Cambodia. Cambodia is kind of cooperation between the Cambodian government and the UN General Assembly. And this is something actually we have to think of it. Unfortunately, the Syrian government will not interested in the subject, but it can be the UN General Assembly, as established the IIIM, which established the Office of Prosecutor before having the court, to collect the evidences of war crimes and crimes against humanity. But it can open up to more creative ideas of an international hybrid court to be able. It's from regional perspective, such crimes happen in Syria. It cannot be happened unless we see the whole region, where it's one of the weakest legal institutions in the world. In the 80s and the 90s, we all witnesses actually the waves of enforced disappearances in Latin America. Later on, when those actually transitioned into democratic governments, Latin America became the vanguard of the ICC. The large number of the countries who actually pushed also of the Universal Declaration against the enforced disappearances. And unless see actually a much more strengthened legal mechanism within the Arab state, within the Middle East, not Syria, maybe later Libya and in Yemen and other countries. This is why the need of regional legal mechanism to be able actually to raise the issue of justice and accountability, because this region, it's the immunity became an answer. And we witnessed this question with the Khashoggi in Saudi Arabia, and now what's going on in Yemen and in Libya, now in Syria. This is why we have to think not only about Syria specifically, but more about strengthening the regional mechanism to make the region actually have. It already have some concept of justice and accountability, but it's never been the case to strengthen this mechanism to be able to prevent such kind of war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Please, go ahead.
Just 2 quick things I would also add on creative mechanisms for justice. I think one, the importance of thinking and engaging on business and human rights, as Hamad was talking about with forced displacement. In those areas where there have been demographic change, countries and businesses are now competing for deals to invest and construct in Syria, and it's important that the legal and civil society community engage with businesses to make sure that they not further war crimes that have been committed by the Assad regime. I think this is a space that there's a lot of momentum on, and it's increasingly growing, but it remains an interesting way to hold not just individual actors and governments accountable, but also businesses as well. And the second thing I would say is the momentum around targeted human rights sanctions. In the US here, we have the Magnitsky Act, and now sanctions vis-a-vis the Caesar bill. Countries around the world are considering targeted human rights sanctions, and while also a piecemeal solution where you're not getting justice for larger entities, you're going after individuals, it is something I think worth considering, particularly as the EU, Australia, and I think a few other places as well are considering sanctions legislation. So civil society engaging with these governments to make sure that this legislation is targeted and goes after the bad actors, whether on human rights abuses or corruption, is also extremely important.
Thank you. I would also add, just to be frank, that while civil society, Syrian or otherwise, European, etc., while civil society can support the bringing about of political settlement to the conflict in Syria, civil society on its own no matter how impressive the infrastructure or the resources that it can and should bring to the table and to the conversation, cannot on its own bring about an end to the conflict. An end to the conflict, negotiating an end to the conflict requires that states, especially key stakeholders, countries like the United States, Turkey, etc., bring to bear consequences, because the number one challenge that we face as civil society is, frankly, the total impunity that all these crimes that I talked about, and Dr. Radwan Ziadeh in his presentation went over. Complete impunity, so lack of consequences. As you know, negotiations are all about leverage. No one is going to give up at the negotiating table what they gained on the battlefield. Since the beginning, the regime has been crystal clear that they're pursuing a military strategy to the conflict. In 2011, it was called a security solution, and then Assad called it military strategy. And through speeches to parliament, he also made that crystal clear. On the other hand, other stakeholders, other countries like the United States, have always been wedded to the refrain that, quote unquote, there is no military solution to the conflict. Okay, so there is a military solution that's being pursued, and that's why Assad has been able to, with the help of Russia and Iran, has been able to reestablish control over, large swath of Syrian territory, because you have the other end of the table saying there's only a political solution. So, unless there are consequences, unless there's an end to impunity, I don't think we can ever have that. In a political settlement in 2011. The American U.S. Department of State, Ambassador Robert Ford came out and said, the aerial bombardment is a red line. The Assad regime was testing the waters at the time. They went through with that. And then the State Department came out and said, fixed-wing aircraft is a red line. And the Assad regime, lo and behold, used fixed-wing aircraft. And then they said, barrel bombs are a red line, and so forth. And then chemical weapons, most infamously or famously, in 2013, they were also supposed to be a red line. And as you know, there was a huge massacre, a chemical attack, Ghouta, August 2013, and there were no consequences. So unless there's an end to impunity, unless there are consequences, there can be no leverage to use in negotiations, and without that, no political settlement to the conflict can be negotiated.
Talking about impunity, Peter Humphrey, who's an intelligence analyst, asks about the Russian role, targeting of schools particularly, and hospitals and other forms of atrocities. Can't we assure Russia right now, that their pilots, their soldiers, their leaders, Putin included, will face war crime prosecution? Why wait till later, May?
Well, I started by saying that we can't wait till later. The time for accountability and accountability and justice is in the immediate. And I think a small example, but the Caesar Act actually goes after the pilots and Russia for the various crimes that they've committed in support of the Syrian regime. So that's just an example of the signaling that's being done. I'm certain that organizations around Europe and the US are beginning, if not already, have put together case files or at least evidence collection around this issue. Like I mentioned, the New York Times investigation that came out a few weeks ago, directly connecting Russia to the planes that actually bombed the hospitals in question. That's excellent evidence, and I am heartened to see that this is something that's being done not just in the civil society and legal space, but also on the media, as this helps create momentum and it helps document the fact that Russia is complicit in these crimes. So I think we're already seeing that happen.
Yeah, and by the way, this New York Times investigation is also an example of how civil society can support these efforts. While it was effective, and the New York Times on their own obtained all those audio recordings that they used to link Russia, actually establish beyond any doubt that Russia was behind those bombings of breadlines in schools and hospitals and so forth. We in the civil society, we also did, we helped them with that because they needed to be connected to eyewitnesses on the ground. They needed to acquire footage and so forth. And this is something that we helped their team with. The Caesar bill, by the way, is another example of how civil society has helped. I don't know if you know, but the whole business of Caesar started as an initiative by civil society. It was not a state-sponsored project at the time. We brought Caesar to Washington, D.C. Caesar did a hearing in Congress. He met with the administration. He shared the trove of tens of thousands of photos he had with the FBI. The FBI authenticated the photos, and certified the photos. The photos were not doctored in any way, shape, or form. And that eventually led to the drafting of the bill, and then the community, the Syrian American community, and others, and other allies threw their support behind the bill, and the bill eventually passed. And now it's state business. So Caesar is also another example of how civil society can help advance this agenda.
Just to add here, the question of Russia and Syria always puzzled me. Because if you look at in the book, I make some comparison. Russia, until today, of course, vetoed 15 Security Council resolutions in Syria, along with the China almost 9. But the Soviet Union itself vetoed 7 times. It looks actually, even in areas, it's a part of the Soviet Union on Russia, like Georgia, Russia vetoed only twice. It looked like Syria, it's part of the deep national security issue in Russia to be more, and that's, Russia invested too much capital and too much military investment in Syria, and leave us as a Syrians question why is that? What's Russian gaining from all of that? With all these reports coming out, the image of Russia as involved in war crimes and crimes against humanity everywhere, and there is no much economic gain from Syria, since most of the oil controlled by the United States right now. This is, until today, it's very difficult to answer this question from rational political scientist behavior, because it's clear Russia it's losing anyway in Syria from any accounts, from justice or accountability, from its image, from economic investment, but what Russia gaining from that, it's very difficult until today actually to find an answer.
All right, we're going to conclude with this question from Francisca, Middle East Institute. She thanks all 3 of you for giving inspiring presentation on the topic. However, the Assad regime, she says, is not the only human rights violator, violation committer or violator in Syria. How do we hold other violators in other areas of Syria also accountable? Particularly, or such as, for example, the Turkish-controlled areas, the SDF-controlled areas. We have 3 minutes, 1 minute each, please.
I reject this kind of questions, because that will leave actually some crimes or war crimes in a vague. And as the Assad always use this argument that we are. And by the way, even Egypt used this argument, and at the Arab League, that we are all in the same level of committing a human rights violation. Why we should care? This is not actually the values we should hold us account for. Of course, there is a massive human rights violations in the region. But when we look into the Syrian regime and how acted against its people, no other accounts can be even close to.
Who are the other players internally in Syria?
And this is why I need here. No, the Syrian government, it's not became rogue state, it's became a deep sectarian militias that has no disregard to any life of any Syrians. And from reading day by day into the decision-making process of the government and how to give all these orders of the barrel bombs and the political prisoners and in all of that, it's impossible to think about political settlement with such kind of militia and control of the Syrian resources in this way. If there is no international efforts actually to take military actions against the Assad government, and we already miss a lot of opportunities, and the famous one was the Red Line. Now this kind of sectarian militias emboldened with the intervention of Russia in September 2015 make it more difficult. What's the end answer? No Syrians or anyone actually have an answer of that, because when you have such militia has a zero disregard of the law, zero disregard of the life of its own citizens, there is nothing to talk about it. There is nothing to leverage or negotiate about it, and we've seen that in the Geneva or in other places. I'm very pessimistic, but this is the reality. And in every time, actually, the United States or other countries try to leverage or negotiate, they come to the same conclusion that this is, and this is why there is no end or any soon of thing of political settlement of the conflict in Syria.
So of course, I agree with the premise of the question. Everyone, regardless of whether they're opposition regime, SDF, US-backed forces, Turkey, everyone who's committed human rights violations in Syria should be held to account, regardless of who they are, because at the end of the day, the thing that we're trying, the thing that we care about the most is justice. And I don't believe that there can ever be peace without justice. And I don't think we can ever deal with the legacy. As a person who is hoping to be able to go back to Syria one day, I don't think we can stabilize the country unless we deal with this legacy. However, I also agree with Dr. Radwan Ziadeh that we should always pose these questions while being completely and fully 100% cognizant of the fact that we should never create a false equivalency between the massive, mammoth-like violations, war crimes, crimes against humanity committed by the Assad regime and by other stakeholders. Because at the end of the day, this is definitely being used by regime backers as a pretext to say, well, everyone is committing human rights, everyone is doing that, everyone is bad. There are no good guys here. And this is a very dangerous slippery slope. Even if you compare, statistically speaking, if you compare the number of casualties of the ISIS reign of terror in Syria to the number of casualties or number of deaths that the Assad regime caused in Syria, there's not even, like, you can't even come close. You're talking basically more than 95% Assad, and you can, I would refer you to the statistics by the Syrian Network for Human Rights, very credible source used by the State Department and others, and I also know that the folks in charge, they're completely credible. You're talking 95% to like 3-4%. And here I'm using what is supposed to be the most horrendous example. I'm using ISIS. Of course, the opposition also has committed, some opposition groups or factions have also committed violations. I would like to see them to account, but again, we need to be careful not to create false equivalency. Now, in response to the question, what do we do to hold them to account? Well, at this level, at this stage, the only thing that we've been able to do is to actually document that. So, Syrian Network for Human Rights documents all abuses, all violations, all crimes, regardless of who committed them. Yesterday, different, not the Syrian Network for Human Rights, a different source. I was looking at a database they compiled of everyone, all civilians who were shot to death by Jordanian border guards and by Turkish border guards as they were fleeing bombardment and seeking safety in Jordan or in Turkey. And the database does not discriminate. It says Jordan, it says Turkey, etc. SDF also, we've seen before that basically coordinates, geographic coordinates were given. Since SDF receives close air support from the United States, in some instances, coordinates were provided to the American military and civilian gathering points where civilians were gathering, like mosques, for example, were knocked out, bombed, and hundreds of people were killed as a result. So there should also be accountability. So at this stage, what we can do and what we've done is do our best to meticulously document that. Sadly, there's a very long way to go on that front, but we should do it while being cognizant that there's absolutely we shouldn't be helping create this false equivalency between the regime and any other actor in the Syrian conflict.
Thank you, Muhammad. May, you have the final word?
Sure. I think it's important to recognize that a victim is a victim. A victim of human rights abuse is a victim, and for the victim, it doesn't matter who committed the abuse. As legal advocates, as accountability, as civil society, it's our job to then ensure that everyone, to the best of our ability, has access to justice. And it will look different depending on who the perpetrator is. It will be different to hold the Syrian regime to account when they are the sitting government in a place, as opposed to a militia. It doesn't mean that it's an either-or question, and I firmly believe as an accountability advocate, it's not an either-or question. And I think that needs to be said. And the heartening thing is that in all of the initiatives that I talked about, there is accountability against different actors. I think we would do well to always recognize who committed crimes and what percentage and all of this, but at the end of the day, our role as advocates is really to ensure that there is accountability and to ensure that anyone who committed a war crime, a human rights abuse, a violation, is held to account in some form, one way or another.
Okay, thank you for your great presentations. Thank you all for being here and for your patience.